I'm Gennike Mayers. I am originally from Trinidad, the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, but I live in the tiny island of Tobago.
Hello and welcome to Obehi Podcast. I'm your host, Obehi Ewanfo, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started into this episode.
I am passionate about languages. That has been the love story of my life. And as I like to say, language opens doors, language bridges barriers. So it's great to be here with you, Obehi, having a conversation, bridging barriers across the globe.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that the opportunity to be able to talk to you and to share this space together. This is very important for me. Like we usually do here, we try to know who we have in front of us because this podcast is dedicated to African diaspora. So for this reason, we are intentional about our origin, where we are coming from. It's not a mistake at all. We're intentional about that. Is some of the things I'm going to be asking you, so it can help also the people that are listening to us. So let's start from the basis. Where were you born? Tell me what you see around you in those places. Give us a little background of yourself as a young person.
Sure. So you speak about the African diaspora. So the history of my region, the Caribbean region, is basically a history that would have been forged for many centuries in slavery. The transatlantic slave trade brought our African ancestors to the Caribbean to work on the mainly sugarcane plantations. And so I live in what is a former British colony, Trinidad and Tobago, which got its independence from Britain in 1962. And so we've had, well, of course, before the arrival of our African ancestors, the Amerindians, those are the indigenous Indians who lived here at the time when Columbus would have rediscovered, and we are very intentional when we say Columbus did not discover the Caribbean, he rediscovered the indigenous peoples who were already living here, living in harmony in the Caribbean when he came. But fast forward to the now. So the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, as I said, is a former British colony. Um, we are quite small on the global scale. We're just about 1.4 million in population. That's probably the equivalent of a small African city, but that's our entire country. And it's split between two islands. The larger island, which is Trinidad, which is a more um, industrial and commercial, and Tobago, a small island, just 60,000 people living here. That's like tiny, tiny little village somewhere, right, in Africa. And tourism is is the focus of the economy here in Tobago. And as a country, a twin island republic, we are a small player on the international oil and gas scene. We produce oil and gas. So as small as we are, we get to hang out with the big players in that particular industry, though we have been making efforts to diversify into agriculture, agro-processing, financial services, tourism, as I mentioned, and to really get away from the fossil fuel industry. So that's sort of the economic background of my country. You asked, what does it look like? Well, we're a tropical Caribbean island, so yes, you can close your eyes and just imagine the aquamarine blue waters, the coconut trees, green everywhere, lots of exotic wildlife, flora and fauna. In particular in Tobago, if I look out my window right now, I don't want to make you jealous, but it's a sea of green. It's just a sea of green, all kinds of different trees, and this is the hour when the birds are out feasting on the tropical fruits. They're waking up to the day. So I live in a paradise.
That's lovely. That is good to hear. That is really good to hear. All right, now tell me about um, your adolescent years. So, uh, growing up in Trinidad and Tobago, uh, tell me a bit about your young adolescent year. What do you remember of that period?
Well, I'd have to say The first memories that come to mind, sincerely, are very troubled. I think I was quite a troubled adolescent. I did have a hard time adjusting. But what kept me anchored, I would say, in school was I discovered foreign languages. I started learning French and Spanish at the age of 10. And that, now with my adult hindsight, I can say that must have been an escape for me. I felt like I was able to discover new countries and cultures, and even take a journey inwardly to myself through foreign languages. And so for 7 years, because like it's that we've inherited the British education system, so it's 7 years or 5 to 7 years of high school. And for those years, I thoroughly enjoyed my experience of learning foreign languages, foreign music, things that really allowed me to escape from my reality at the time that was a bit troublesome.
What do you mean troublesome? Can you explain that? Yeah.
So at the time, my parents were going through a divorce. I am the eldest of three siblings, and I felt like I really had the weight of the world on me. Also having the weight of sort of sheltering my younger siblings at the time, through that period that my parents were going through. For anyone who has been in a family where there's separation or divorce, you would know that it's not a pleasant experience. And while, of course, adults make these decisions for themselves, it does affect the family structure, it does affect the children. So when I say it was a troublesome period, I don't want to go into detail, but I was a very troubled adolescent. On the flip side of that, though, as I said, I think the school experience was able to ground me, and learning foreign languages was a way to escape my reality and really almost take on a new persona, because even in my later years, I recognize that when I speak a foreign language, I am channeling a different personality. I am almost not the same person when I'm speaking French compared to when I speak Spanish or English. I'm not schizophrenic, but there is just something about the language that embodies an entire culture. And it's almost as if you put on a garment of culture when you adopt that language. And that has been the case, it still is the case, in my profession now as an interpreter. When I put on my French brain, my voice, my tone changes, my voice is different, my pace is different, I'm thinking differently. So um, I can say it now as an adult, looking back at my adolescent time, that is something that would have molded me. Learning languages certainly molded me, molded my way of thinking, my perspective of the world, because I was through reading, through listening to interviews and news in a foreign languages, you're literally filtering the world through those languages. I don't know if you're understanding what I'm saying, but
Hey, yeah, sure,
it's
sure,
a
sure, sure.
filter.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
I'm coming to that. I will try to understand. That is very important. It's very, very important. Now, I would like you to spend a few seconds explaining to us about the culture that you grew up with. Tell us something about that. Okay, you give us some background, the green and the environment, the tourist attraction, as it were. But in terms of the culture, the behavior, the the costume of the people, what do you want to say about that? I mean, your people there.
I think the one thing, or the first thing, that we are known for in Trinidad and Tobago is our multicultural, multi-ethnic society. And that came about because of history. So, as I mentioned earlier, we had our African ancestors who came during slavery, when slavery was abolished in between 1834 1838. Indian indentured laborers were then brought in because somebody had to work on the sugarcane plantations. So the Indian indentured laborers were brought in. This was another wave of migration that came to the Caribbean and more specifically to Trinidad and Tobago. And then we've had successive waves of migrants who came from Asia, from Europe, from Middle East. And so that has really given rise to a multi-ethnic society where you walk around in the streets and you can't really speak about a pure breed. There's just so much mixing and intermarriages that people look like they could be from any part of the world. You have people with African traits, Indian traits, Caucasian traits mixed. You look at me, you can't necessarily tell exactly what went into me, but I've got a little bit of African, a little bit of Indian, a little bit of, I have ancestors from neighboring Venezuela as well, and Amerindians, the indigenous Indians who lived here. So I'm not saying everybody looks like me, but everybody has some kind of a mix. So that's from the multi-ethnic perspective. In terms of multicultural, so all of these different ethnic groups brought with them their customs and their traditions. So today you find, for example, I mean, I love food. I'm a foodie. So let's talk about food. We have such a variety of food. We've got, food that might have been adapted to the crops that were grown here, but resemble food that you would find on the African continent as well. So we use a lot of corn. From the Indians, we have a lot of rice and different kind of rotis, what they call roti, dal puri, different sort of flour-based flatbread type dishes that the Indians brought, and of course curry, masala, jira. These are spices that would have come with them that we use a lot in our food. And what's interesting is that there are national dishes from pretty much every ethnic group. So we have a dish called doubles. It's like a breakfast. It's like a little fried fried flour with curried chickpeas, and people line up to buy these things. Hardly anyone makes it at home, but you go there, lots of these doubles vendors everywhere, and that's like the national breakfast. Everybody eats this. You don't have to be Indian to eat doubles. We have a dish called pilau, which is it's from the African roots. Sorry about my dog in the background, but she's hearing me speaking and she's wondering why aren't you speaking to me? But so we have the pilau, which is like a rice and peas mix. And this is from our African heritage. It's like rice and peas cook up. And we've got a dish that I particularly love that I make very well, and it's called pastel. It's actually from our Venezuelan heritage because there was a wave of Venezuelan migrants who came to Trinidad when the Spanish were in charge. So we've had different colonial masters. We had the Spanish, we had the British who were here, the French had a little season before they got bumped out. And so we have dishes from that era that now have become the traditional dish at Christmas time. That's like the national Christmas dish, pastels, but came from Venezuela. So there really is a very diverse range of food. Um, we can talk about the culture as well, the music. Our music is world music. It's a fusion music. We gave birth to music called calypso, which is along the lines of social commentary. It's very what we call conscious music with a very Caribbean tropical beat, calypso. And our country also gave birth to the only instrument that arose in the 21st century, the steel pan. And the steel pan came about from the the drums, the barrels that are used to store oil. Some brilliant man named Spree Simon decided to take one of those oil drums and mold it into an instrument that we play today. There is a national steel orchestra, and this steel pan has been exported around the globe. And this instrument, this fascinating instrument that's extremely versatile, came out of an oil drum. So I can go on and on and on. Those are just
Powerful.
a few examples
Mhm.
of the rich diversity of our Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago culture.
It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. I love it. In fact, I wouldn't like you to stop, but anyway, at the point where we're going to have to. That is really great. It's great. One thing I wanted to say is that how simple is it to put all these different culture together in one to create this multi cultural society from multi ethnic society? It basically appeared to me that this is the whole world put together in one place with all the kaleidoscope, with all the beauty in it.
Most of the time, we live in peace and harmony. Let's just say that. When we look at the demographics of the population, according to the last statistics, it's about 40% persons of African descent, 40% of Indian descent, and 20% is just mixed up with everything else that, or everyone else that would have come to our shores. And as I said, for the most part, we live in harmony. I would say that harmony is threatened whenever there is a general election. Let me explain. Politically, the political parties that have emerged since independence have been along the lines of ethnicity. So there's one party that is generally recognized as the Indian party. There's another party that's generally recognized as the African party. And there have been over the decades, we're just over 50 years old in terms of independence, there have been other parties, political parties that showed up on the scene that tried to propose some sort of alternative to these two major parties, with limited success, I would say. But what tends to happen around election time, and I'm not a political scientist, I'll give you my opinion, which is simply that the politicians tend to play around with this issue of ethnicity and class to sort of bolster their supporters, because politicians know who the core of their supporters are, and they will pander to their supporters who are of a particular ethnicity. And I say this and I call it out because it is particularly dangerous, the ways in which we've all seen politicians use these kinds of discourse and tricks to almost play one against the other. And it should not be tolerated. It is something that is, it really has no place in our society. And it's something that I would like to see change in my lifetime. Unfortunately, there is, I would say, a majority of people of a certain age who buy into these kind of tricks and ideas. And let's just face it, I'm sorry to say this, I love my country, but sometimes you have to call things out. There are people who will listen to and absorb and believe anything you present to them without questioning, without trying to analyze. And these people are in a majority, and so they will go along with um, these kind of statements being made by certain politicians about who is superior. And again, I say that there's no place in our society for that. So every 5 years, which is when we have general elections, according to the Westminster system, the political system as well, parliamentary system has been inherited from the British colonial days. So we still have that parliamentary system where we vote for members of parliament, and those in the majority form the government. Whichever party wins the most votes forms the government. And so every 5 years, we have this sort of disturbance of our general peace and general good relations. And I would like to really see that change to a point where we can hold all our politicians accountable, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of our ethnicity. We want to make sure that we are being best served by the people that we elect into power. Because when you get into power, you are governing an entire nation. You're not just governing one ethnic group or one social class. So that's a bit of my rant and my my plea as well, that we stop playing these really silly games when it comes to politics.
Thank you for that. Thank you for reminding me that also, because in Africa, in many parts of Africa, that also is happening. A good example would be in Nigeria, where you have three major ethnic groups: the Hausa, the Igbo, the Yoruba. So a lot of the politicians that we have try to play politics along this line, and it's a politics of division instead of a politics of unity. And this division have been hampering the Nigerian national identity and the progress of the country. Because oftentimes you have a leader who, of course, they know that maybe it is of because we have a presidential system now. If they know that as a president, elected as a president of the country, you are going to govern the entire country. You are going to have the armed forces under your control, the police, all the institutions, both local and both domestic and foreign policy. You are going to be in charge of that, which means you're not only going to be representing the Yoruba, the Hausa, or the Igbo in this case. You're going to be representing the entire country. So why not just play the politics of the country, of the interests of the people? What do the people want? Sometimes they are very trickish in this, in that by the time they start playing this ethnic politics, you no longer come with the question of national identity. That suffers at the end of it. But if you look at the people now, just like you were saying in case of Trinidad and Tobago, the Nigerian people, they want to live in peace. They want to live among themselves. The Hausa, the Yoruba, the Igbo. Of course, I'm just mentioning these three. If you go to Nigeria, there are lots of ethnic group you don't even hear of. No, all these people are able to live in peace. Indeed, they live in peace. They intermarriage among them. They do businesses among themselves. They don't have any problem. But
Hmm.
when politics come in, they start dividing. They start creating all sort of artificial boundary for themselves. And it really has got to stop, like you put it. But how can it stop? Both in the case of Trinidad Tobago and in Nigeria and in some other African countries, because we want it to stop. We can live in peace from different ethnic backgrounds.
It will take some analysis and people willing to question the system. And questioning the system doesn't mean being disrespectful. It means exercising your right and your freedom to question what's being said to you, and to seek truth. We inherited, we are the product of an education system based on the British colonial system, in which people have been, I would say, formatted um, to write exams, to pass exams, and not necessarily to think critically. Um, I would say it's quite rare to find people who question what is being offered to them on a plate. People generally accept that whatever you're offering to them, that's the truth. And I'm saying that we need to be citizens who are more analytical. We need to exercise our freedom to ask questions, without disrespecting anyone, without antagonizing anyone, without making defamatory remarks about anybody's character. But we should be able to exercise our freedom to question what's being said, and to seek information, to seek the truth about what's being presented to us, not just by politicians, but people across the board. And even as you spoke of some of the ethnic groups in Nigeria, it's just brought back to memory that some of these are some of our ancestors here, because in the days of slavery, a lot of our ancestors would have come from the West Coast, the Gold Coast, and so we do have descendants of the Igbos, descendants of Mandingos, Ashanti, the different tribes from the West Coast. So now I'm thinking, well, maybe maybe some of the The residue then is what we are experiencing today.
Yeah, it is partly the responsibility of the people, but it is majorly based on the configuration of the country by the British. In that the way they structure the system, they sort of hit one against the other. It is not necessarily because the people are coming from different ethnic background. This different ethnic background, which might be in this case whether the Madiga, the Igbo, the Ashanti, the Yoruba. Okay, they are different people, yes, but they have not always been fighting among themselves. There have been a way of interacting, you know. But when we ask them to come and stay together, of course, not based on certain agreement among them, based on the agreement of other people. These people, of course, I'm talking of the European power now. They didn't leave the people to also evolve. You know, they didn't leave the system to evolve because you know it's like a marriage. In the beginning, you talk about divorce. No, this is something that happened. In that when you bring a woman and a man from different home to come and form a family, we cannot pretend that everything is going to be well all the time. For that marriage to work, there are going to be sacrifice. There are going to be okay, yes, you are not going to be right all the time. You are going to allow your partner to be right too and accept when you are wrong. This is when it is normal. But there are some times that some people can come to elevate the error of the other in order for some other ulterior motive. In the case of nations now, like Nigeria, the people are not allowed to really evolve naturally among themselves. The colonial system deliberately favors certain part of the community, certain part of the nation, so that there can be this tension, this division. And the reason for this is to make sure that the people do not concentrate on their real problems. Because if they concentrate on their real problem, they will be able to solve it, no? But because
Mm.
now they are focusing on artificial things that are not really there, and while they are fighting among themselves, then this colonial system can begin to favor themselves, no? That is basically the explanation. So, as to whether maybe the people from West Africa just naturally do not know how to live among themselves, probably this is why the African diaspora inherited it. I don't think is true. Yes, but even where you are there, because the same British that colonized Nigeria is the same that is colonizing the same place there. So the system is basically the same.
The
That
system is
is my take.
broken. The system is broken. Yes.
Now, looking at it from that perspective, how do you define your own identity today? I mean, what would you like to say even about that? Then we are moving into languages now because all these, of course, they are tying together.
That it's a tricky question, I'll tell you. And I like the question. I'm searching my thoughts. How do I really define myself? I guess most often than not, I would refer to myself, I would label myself as a Caribbean woman. Now, but what does that mean to somebody who is not from the Caribbean? Um, I think by and large, because we're such small countries in the Caribbean, um, maybe we tend to want to try to feel bigger by associating ourselves with some sort of bigger entity, and that entity would be the Caribbean. Um, to me, then, when I say I'm a Caribbean woman, I recognize the region in which I live because when you go from one island to the next, we're mainly an archipelago of islands, although there are a few countries on the South American continent that identify as Caribbean countries because they have a shoreline with the Caribbean Sea. So it's a geographical area, the Caribbean Sea, the Caribbean Basin. But I think beyond the geography, there is that common history of having all welcomed slaves. That slaves were the ones who built these countries, built the economies of these countries, whether it was under the British colonial rule, the French colonial, the Spanish colonial rule. We had the Dutch colonial rule in the region as well. Um, so I think there's a sense of that common identity of being Caribbean. But what does that mean? For me, it means that we are, and I'm quoting one of my favorite political leaders in the region, who is the Prime Minister of Barbados, Miss Mia Mottley, when she says, F comes before I, family comes before ideology. And she was speaking about political ideology, that we may have different political beliefs or persuasions, but she speaks about this notion of a Caribbean family, and that's how I feel about Caribbean people. I've traveled a lot throughout the Caribbean region. I've lived in other Caribbean countries for longer periods, not just visiting. And there is a sense of community. There's a sense that we share a lot of traits in common. We have a love of music, a love of dance, a love of food. There are different iterations of the same food in different Caribbean countries. We have a particular way that we dance. It's a Caribbean rhythm. And again, this crosses over whether it's the French Caribbean, Spanish Caribbean, British Caribbean. There is just some sense of community in this region. I like to say that the whole Caribbean is my playground. I can go anywhere in the Caribbean and feel at home. Once I step out of the Caribbean, then I feel like I'm in a foreign country. Then I feel like I am the foreigner, I am the migrant, I am in some cases, I'm the intruder, I'm the odd one out once I step out of the physical Caribbean space. But to give you a name or a description or a label of Caribbean would be difficult. It's quite difficult.
Thank you for your explanation. That is very important. In fact, that is what we want to hear. We want to hear how you see it. The way you see it, that is good enough. That is what it is. There is no way that everyone must abide by. There are the ways upon which we see things, and that is what makes it even more beautiful. And again, we are talking of multiculturality, multi-ethnicity, plural society, which is the way the world is today. Even though there are some people, both here in Europe and in some other parts of the world, in the United States, who think that there is a pure race, there is a pure group of people, where it is difficult to even find this pure group of people, and certainly not in 2022. We are not going to be able to recreate that world again. Maybe one time in the distant past, there were very few people who probably have one culture among them. Probably it will never happen again. And you remember, for example, the movement of Marcus Garvey, and many after that also, this idea of Africa unite and maybe Africans returning back to the base, no?
Hmm.
Well, we are going to have to understand that, and we're going to understand it from a different light now. That probably these more than 500 million Africans in the diaspora are probably not really going to return to stay in Africa. Some of them might return, which is a question of choice. It needs to be a choice. Why we might not necessarily be talking of physical return to stay in Africa, we can connect, we can collaborate, we can work together, we can understand our history. But we must give our children the liberty to choose, where do you want to stay? How do you see yourself? So this is where I come to the question of identity. This is where I really find it very interesting. If you look at the African diaspora very critically, you see that the question of identity is so important. It's an argument that is so critical for all of us. Whether you are in the first generation, in the second generation, in the fifth or the sixth generation, is always an issue that must come out. Except maybe you are just denying it. If you understand it, then it's always going to come. And sometimes we are all going to respond to it differently. Now, That connects all to actually the way I got the word connection is because of your language. Because
Mm.
before we started to record just now, you didn't make mention of language as a connection or as a connective factor, or maybe connected people. So this is where I'm going in here now. Help me understand how you get into languages and language as a connective factor.
This was a new world that was open to me in high school when I started learning Spanish and French. And I think I just hid in that world because it was a world that provided comfort to me, and a great escape. But it also became my superpower in the sense that that's the only thing I was good at in high school. So I pretty much just grasped that. I latched onto it and I held on to it because that was like my life buoy, my life jacket. That's what kept me afloat in the sea of trouble. And I can look back now and think, well, some people say, well, I had no choice. I couldn't choose any of the subjects. In our British colonial system, you have to choose the subjects that you want to write for your O level exam and then your A level exam. So I didn't have a choice. That was my choice. That was all I was good at. But moving on from there, I quickly was able to see and experience how, without even leaving my country, because I didn't have my parents, didn't have the financial means after the divorce um, to allow me to participate in sort of travel linguistic programs and that kind of thing. Um, but without even leaving my country, I was able to host French students from neighboring islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe who would come to Trinidad and Tobago. Every year there was this student exchange program through the Alliance Française. And so through hosting those students at home for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I was exposed to their language. And these connections, these very real connections, again, further opened up my realm of possibilities. I started to see and to understand that speaking foreign languages could be my way out of trouble. Could be my career. And so I really pursued foreign languages with all my heart. And in the end, I succeeded brilliantly, I would say, in foreign languages. But it really was because I had already understood in my teenage years that this could open career doors for me. And so at the very first opportunity, and there's one moment and one anecdote that stands out for me right after high school. So I didn't have the luxury of going straight on to university again. Didn't have the financial means. So I took a break and I got a job, um, where I was a trainee journalist at the time. And during my duties as a journalist, there was this business delegation that came from Martinique from the Chamber of Commerce. And they held a press conference, and I was covering that press conference for the news. And of course, they speak French. So when I approached them to interview them and I spoke French to them, they were all, so amazed. Like, who is this Trinidadian person speaking to us in French in their own language? And so I was able to interview them. Well, I had to interview in English for the news, but we were able to chat and exchange phone numbers in the time after. And at the very first opportunity that I got many years later to travel to Martinique, um, I still had those business cards, and I can tell you, I called, I reached out to those people I had met many years before, and it was like, the time had not passed. I was able to go visit places that I would not have been able to access if I didn't speak French. And so that made it very real for me that language is a connector, language opens doors of opportunity, language bridges barriers. And so when I stepped into Martinique for the very first time, I felt like I had so many friends there because people remembered me, people remembered that connection that we had. I was being invited out to dinners, to cocktail receptions, to conferences, weekends on, somebody's boats, all doors were open to me just because I spoke their language. And it leads me to a quotation that I love from Nelson Mandela, which is, you speak to a man in a language that he understands and it goes to his head. But if you speak to a man in his language, it goes to his heart. And that really sums up the power of mastering a foreign language, because you are the bridge across the language barrier when you can speak to someone in their language. And that's what I've been able to do in many circumstances right here in the Caribbean region. As I mentioned earlier, we would have had the Spanish colonial masters, the British, the French. And so, right within this small geographical space of the Caribbean, we have countries with official languages that are very different, and which can be a language barrier if you don't speak that language. But for me, because I speak these languages, French, Spanish, English, and Creole, I can literally hop from one island to the next without feeling alienated by the language because I speak these languages. And that is the power, as I say, the superpower of connecting via languages.
Thank you so much for that. That is very important. That is cool. That is really cool. All right, Creole. What do you mean by that?
So in our region, you have the official languages of our former colonial masters, and then you've had languages that have evolved here, sort of secret code languages that would have developed again among our slave ancestors. So you have in the region what would be known as dialects, as a pidgin languages, and in the case of Creole, it's major in major part the French Creole, which is spoken in Haiti, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and neighboring former British colonial islands of St. Lucia. I wish I had a map to show you, but St. Lucia and Dominica, former British colonial islands. But because of the geographical proximity to French-speaking Martinique and Guadeloupe, they share a Creole language, which is very similar. And so they can communicate among themselves without speaking official French or official English. And so these are languages that have developed in the region, that I've also had the opportunity to learn because I lived in Haiti, I lived in Martinique for 3 years, Guadeloupe for 6 years, Haiti for 3 years, and so I've been able to learn this almost like a code language that exists today, that is used in the case of Haiti. Um, Haitian Creole is recognized alongside French as the official language of the country.
That's interesting. Which means now, if a message were to be communicated and you maybe only speak the official language and they don't want you to understand it, they can speak this language and you are cut off.
Yes. So for foreigners, and this is, I have so many anecdotes, but um, for foreigners traveling to Haiti, because French is one of the official languages, if you speak French, of course, then you can deal with the administration, you can get business done in Haiti when you speak French. But if you really want to get down into the culture of the people and really understand their mindset, their culture, their passion, you need to understand Creole. And what I've found over the years is, and this is having worked in Haiti post 2010 earthquake, where a lot of humanitarians were coming in to assist from across the globe, and the French-speaking humanitarians thought that they had an advantage, which they did. In being able to deal with the administration and attend government meetings and that kind of thing, there certainly was an advantage if you mastered French. But what I discovered for myself is that having lived previously um, in Martinique and Guadeloupe and having learned French Creole, I was able to connect with the people on the ground, the people who had been impacted by the earthquake. I was able to understand their stories, very painful stories to listen to, stories of loss, stories of death, stories of grief. But I was able to listen actively. I was able to empathize from a place of understanding their language and not being forced, so to speak, to impose French on them or to impose my native English on them. And I can tell you, Bay, that made the world of difference. I look back and I know that that was a life changing moment for me that completely altered the trajectory of my life and my career. And it's because um, I understood Creole.
This Creole, is it a language that everybody understand and some people understand the official language? Or is it a language that you need to go to school to understand? Can you say anything about that?
Traditionally, it's the language that the parents spoke when they wanted to tell secrets in front of their children. And actually, going back to the colonial days or the early days of independence, parents did not want their children to learn or to speak the Creole. And that's still a debate that's quite active in the French countries, in particular, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint Martin, Haiti. Not so much in Haiti, but there was this notion that Creole was a code language and that if you wanted to be considered to be respectable in the eyes of the administration, then you needed to speak official French. And so it was you were looked down on if you spoke Creole at school in the courtyard. Um, Luckily, that has changed, and luckily for me, when I first lived in Martinique and Guadeloupe, and I was actually teaching English there. I was teaching English to primary school students, and that was my initial contact, um, real exposure to Creole, where I was listening in on the children who were speaking Creole in the courtyard during recess. And that's how I started learning the Creole. I would have been hearing songs in Creole before, but not necessarily understanding the meaning. But I started learning from the children. So I was teaching them English, but they didn't know that I was learning Creole from them in the courtyard. And then eventually I did take the opportunity to learn through a tutor. I was able to get some Creole classes because I was interested. I wanted to figure out this secret code. So I got myself a tutor and I learned Creole. And then when I eventually went to Haiti, in the context of the earthquake, the I worked with the Red Cross at the time, and it was offered to us as staff to learn Creole officially because our employer recognized how critical it was to be able to speak the language of the people, not just the language of the administration and the government. Because we were on the ground, we were, delivering water and medical assistance and so forth to the people. And so many of us colleagues did take the opportunity to learn Creole. And I still have the book somewhere around my desk here. I still have the Creole book that I was learning from. It's like an infant's book, but I was an infant learner of Creole. So yeah, I broke the code.
Thank you for that. All right. Now, another thing that I really find interesting in your work, in the way that you refer to language as a connector, is that in our demography, this is a very important thing, no? In that many people in in that demography are in the diaspora, the African diaspora, no? Okay, African immigrant also, if we want to put it like that, people that are coming from Africa who are emigrating to either Europe or other part of the Western country. So, to these people, it is very important, I think, that they learn the language of the people so they can communicate. Because immigration sometimes is a very funny thing, in that he will say, okay, I'm traveling from maybe Ghana or Nigeria to maybe France or UK. I will just go there. In 2 or 3 years, I will be back. That's all. Well, in most of the cases, it's not like that. You get there, for many Africans that are in Europe as immigrants, maybe those that are passing through because now it is difficult to get visa, no? When I came here with a visa which expired, of course. So I'm not a little different from many of them that are coming, only that, okay, I had a visa, I flew to this place, and I still have to pass through the stress anyway because I stayed for a very long time, I didn't have paper. So those years quickly go away from you. So you question of what an immigrant is become real to you. So in that sense, if you don't understand the language of the people you are going to be living with, life becomes difficult for you. And not only that, very soon, if you are a young person, because I came to Italy, I was 24 years old. Now, very soon, you get married, then you become a parent. When you become a parent now, that thing that you were saying, I will just come here in 5 or 3 years, I will be back. You see, it's not really practical as it is, no? So you're not deciding to learn the language, become a very huge mistake on your part because you are going to suffer the consequence of that. Because like you are saying, now you don't understand the language of the people. How are you going to be able to understand the people? How are you going to be able to interact with them? This is a problem I have seen a lot, at least among many Nigerians in Italy. And it is true if you go also to France, to Germany. Okay, if they were to travel maybe to UK or to US, it's a different thing because they speak English, no? But I'm really interested in the language because everybody in this world is not going to speak English. If you are an immigrant, or maybe you are a person who decided to leave your country to another country, and you want to connect. So I want you to speak to that, the importance of learning the language of the people so you can connect, so you can communicate.
Absolutely, Obehi. And you've opened up a Pandora's box there. I have to figure out where should I start. But the first thought that comes to mind. So I have also been a migrant to the countries where I traveled and I lived and worked um, and settled for a while. And but the thing that really strikes me, I would say, is right here in my own country. So right now, Trinidad and Tobago is host to a wave of Venezuelan migrants since 2018 in particular, since the presidential elections of 2018, and the economic and political crisis in Venezuela, there has been a massive movement of Venezuelan migrants to my country. Now, we've had Venezuelans coming to Trinidad and Tobago for decades, for centuries even. And Trinidadians going to Venezuela to go shopping. So we've had friendly relations with Venezuela as our neighbor for all times. But because this was such a huge influx in a short space of time, literally overnight, what happened here in Trinidad and Tobago was a very strong reaction. So in the first instance, yes, a sense of solidarity that okay, we hear what's happening in our neighboring country, we hear about the difficulties, and yes, we welcome our neighbors. But as you said, as time goes on and then people settle, they're not just here temporarily and then planning to go back to their home because many of them traveled without their families. They came here to try to seek a better life, to find a job, to earn some income to send back home to their families, and then eventually go back to Venezuela. That's what many of the business I speak to, that was their plan. But that was 2018. We're in 2022, and they're still here. And so, what has really struck me in my own country, the experience of being host to migrants, is that the sort of honeymoon period was quickly over in terms of that expression of solidarity towards our Venezuelan neighbors. And now more and more the conflict is rising. So there's a lot more conflict around the presence of Venezuelans in our country. Now, this is quite ironic for me because 10 to 15 years ago, under previous political administration, there was a huge move to promote Spanish as the first foreign language of our country. We were getting into trade relations with South America. And so the administration at the time wanted everybody to learn Spanish There was a massive campaign where street names were being converted into Spanish and English signage. We had bilingual street signs. When you would go into the government offices, the signage was bilingual. And so there was a massive push to get our population, our English speaking population, to learn Spanish. And here it is 15 years later, we have a tremendous opportunity to be able to speak Spanish, practice Spanish, perfect our Spanish because of the presence of Venezuelan migrants in our midst. And ironically, and I just cannot understand it, this is where you have our local population pushing back against Spanish. Why these people come here and speak in Spanish? Why they don't learn to speak English? Okay, yes, there is merit in them learning to speak English. I fully agree with that. Yes, the Venezuelans who come here should learn to speak the language of their host. I agree. But on the flip side, why don't we learn to speak Spanish? Embrace the fact that we have the opportunity right now to speak Spanish with these migrants who are in our midst, who are working in our communities, who are going, sending their children to school where our children go to school. Why don't we seize that opportunity to improve our Spanish instead of what's actually happening where there is a pushback? That is something I do not understand. And I look on as a very interested party because I speak Spanish. So, when I meet Venezuelans here, I ask them whether they want to practice their English because many of them are making the effort to learn English. I ask them if they want to speak English. If not, I can speak to them in their language. But it's something that boggles my mind. Another anecdote I would share really quickly is I've had the privilege of traveling to and living in countries where I spoke the language of the host country. So it was never an issue for me personally. I was able to fit in quite seamlessly. But for the first time, when I went to a country where I did not speak the language, and I was there for a year, this was in Bangladesh, I found myself in a very curious predicament of needing the services of an interpreter. Now, I am an interpreter. I work in French, Spanish, and English. But when I went to Bangladesh to work, I needed an interpreter to be able to communicate with the people there who did not speak English. And so it was very curious for me to feel what it's like to depend on someone to communicate my ideas and to be able to understand what somebody else is saying, that I had to use the filter of an interpreter to help me do my job. Again, I was working with the Red Cross in the Rohingya refugee movement, where you had people leaving Myanmar, fleeing violence there to seek safety in Bangladesh, and having to communicate with persons who were traumatized to hear their stories and to be able to amplify their stories, but needing an interpreter to do so. So I understand that migrant experience of hearing sounds, hearing a tongue, a language that you have no clue what's being said. You're completely bewildered when you don't speak the language of your host. And so yes, it's very important to make the effort, and it is an effort and it is a sacrifice, and it does require discipline to learn the language of your host country. But I recognize that the sooner you do it, the better it is for you, for your interactions with the people there, to feel that sense of connection and community. You need to be able to speak the language of the people who are welcoming you into their space. So I definitely want to make a plug for that. Learn the language of your host country.
Thank you so much for that. It is what a lot of people have been saying because the excuses are very many sometimes. Some people will say, okay, well, I'm just here for some time. I'm not Italy's not be the country. I'll just pass it.
Mm,
I get it. I get it. You're just passing. But the thing is that if you learn one language, you know more. It's not. Language cannot be a disadvantage. It's always an advantage to you, not to the people you are learning their language. It is to you because it's a way of communication. This is why I really like the term that you use. That language is a connector. It helps you to connect. Before I started this interview with you, I did an interview with a woman who is running for to be a local councillor here in the city of Verona. It's an Italian, no? Okay, it's not that everybody must do that, no? But this is my job. I interview people, no? It is true that we are using English now, but I can also do it in Italian. I do have a version of Obehi Podcast only in Italian.
Excellent.
So the thing is that it helped me. It's not happy. It's not for the I'm not doing it for the Italian people. I'm doing it for myself. This is my story. It is not the Italian story. If maybe for example somebody is running for a political office here, they want to speak to the Italian people, they will not come to me. There are other channels, Italian, that they can go to. But because I make myself available, I learn the language and I have a platform to be able to do this, I can say, hey, welcome. You don't need to speak English. I speak your language because I am in your land.
Bravo.
I think it is a common sense that people just should do. All right, a question for you. Have you ever learned a new language? What are the difficulty of learning a new language? Let's spend some time there.
I think discipline is the greatest challenge. So last year, I committed to learning German. I have a German textbook, workbook from since the age of 17. It was one of my goals at the time after learning French and Spanish. I thought I wanted to learn German. And just a quick anecdote. Tobago is a very popular tourist destination for Scandinavian visitors. And at one point, there were a lot of German visitors, Swedish, Danish, Austrian visitors to Tobago. And so at the time, I thought, maybe I can learn German. Maybe one day I can work in the tourism sector. Fast forward, 30 years. I found the book in a box last year and I thought, oh, let me get back into German. But really, I did not discipline myself to learn. And of course, learning techniques have evolved over the years. It's a lot easier now to learn a new language. You have so many different apps you can download on your mobile phone or on your computer. You don't have to go to a physical classroom and get a tutor to learn a language. Matter of fact, you can get tutors online. You can pay by the hour, pay as you go, tutors. There's so many different ways you can learn languages. But in my case, I think it's the discipline that was lacking. I've been building a business since I returned home in 2020, and so that became my priority, and I sincerely didn't commit the time needed to learn German in the way that I would. But I know that it's still a goal that I have. I may not get to the level of proficiency in German that I have in French and Spanish, which I've been learning and still learning over 30 years. But I just like the thought of being able to add an additional language to my quiver.
Now, talking always of the connection, looking at our demography, the African diaspora, whether it is only for the question of language or any other thing in between, um, how do you see the possibility of us able to connect among ourselves and even do businesses? Why not? Because in this channel, we try to promote that a lot. Because I think, like I was saying before, though, we don't necessarily need to make the physical transfer to
Return,
Africa.
yes,
That is not
yes.
what we need to do. This world belongs to us. We can live anywhere we want to live, but we must connect. So tell me about that connection. How do you feel about it?
Well, I'm happy to say that it's a connection that exists. Right here in Trinidad and Tobago, we have an association known as the Emancipation Support Committee. And so they have taken on the mandate of celebrating our African identity and traditions here locally. And so every year, particularly at Emancipation Day, which is on August 1st. That's when we celebrate the emancipation of slavery. They organize huge festivities, and they would bring in speakers from the African continent, from different countries every year. So there's an intellectual exercise, lots of lectures and debates to inform and educate people. But there's also the cultural aspect, having groups perform different types of cultural activities, and of course the food. We can't get away from the food. You must have food. So the full culinary traditions are on display at that time of the year. But outside of that festival, you do have businesses. We do have African migrants among us. I can't give you figures off the top of my head, but we do have quite a few countries represented here, including Nigeria, including some of the French-speaking African countries, Mali, Senegal, Cameroon, and so people, as you have mentioned before, people may have come here for whatever reasons for a short time, and then they end up getting married, they have children, they settle down, and so we do have Africans in our midst who have made here home. On a broader scale, if I'm looking throughout the Caribbean region, just recently, a couple of weeks ago, Barbados, our neighboring Caribbean country, Barbados, signed an MOU with for an air services agreement with the government of Ghana. So that is going to open airlift between Ghana and Barbados. And of course, Barbados being in the Caribbean, it means that the whole of the Caribbean is going to be able to benefit from this direct air service. So I think we are going to see more travel both ways. Physically, Caribbean people going to see the motherland, and persons from Africa coming to see what their descendants have become, how we've settled in the Caribbean, and how we've grown up. But we do have African-owned businesses in the region. We have right now, actually, this week, it's the African Film Festival here in Trinidad and Tobago. It's actually a girlfriend of mine who directs the festival, and basically it showcases the best of African films here, so that we can get to see ourselves and see our ancestors, see where we came from. We get to see it on film. So there are things that are going on. The connections are there. There are many layers of connections as well. And so I think it bodes very well, even for the physical connection, to be able to not just return to Africa, but have Africans come and discover the Caribbean for themselves. Come and see, how we've evolved here in the Caribbean.
Yeah. I read about the that airline flight. I said, well, wow, this is something really interesting. It really is interesting. Um, Now, let me ask you maybe a kind of intellectual question, just an opinion of yours. Now, if you were to propose a kind of connection that should really exist between Africa and the African diaspora, and in this case, the Caribbean, which area do you think are the most important to concentrate on in networking among ourselves? That is between the Caribbean and African countries.
Well, I think business is probably the place to start. I think having trade, import export of goods, services, that might motivate people to take an additional step, which might be learning the language. Interestingly enough, my alma mater, the University of the West Indies, where I studied, does offer Yoruba classes. So we do have a possibility here to learn the Yoruba language. And so I think that would be a next step. I believe people need to have some form of motivation to learn a language. Otherwise, you don't just go language, well, maybe some people learn languages just for the fun of it. But I think if there's an economic imperative, people will invest the time, because it is an investment, both of time, effort, money, to learn language. But I think one can trigger the next. And coming out of that, I think we can see much more meaningful connections, to come back to that term, where beyond the business side, people will be inspired to really gain a broader understanding, a deeper understanding of where we came from. Because Africa is part of our history, it's part of our story. So I think the language will allow for that deeper understanding.
This is 2022. This is when we are talking of opening up airline direct flight from the Caribbean to Africa. And we want to even call that a progress. Yes, it is a progress. Um, why is it that it's only now that we are even talking of that? Why it wasn't possible before?
Well, I don't know the intimate details of that agreement, and I can't speak for our political leaders because let's just be clear. These kind of agreements are signed in a political framework. There has to be some kind of policy in place um, before agreements like this are signed. But I would say perhaps after that colonial period, we in the Caribbean would have been left with vestiges of, uh, let's just say, connections to that other colonial master, not the British, not the French, not the Spanish, but the United States of America, because we have taken part in, we have absorbed so much of that culture through cable television, through the music. It's almost become a substitute culture, and I think we have traditionally had our eyes set on North America rather than looking back, so to speak, at where we came from. That's my opinion. It can be argued. I'm sure there are people who will disagree with me, and that's fine. But my opinion is that we replaced one culture, in our case in Trinidad and Tobago, the British culture under colonial days. We replaced that with American culture because that's who we traded with. And, there's one of our ministers who likes to say, follow the money. If you follow the money, that's our major trade partner. And so there's bound to be some sort of influence being exerted on our traditions, our culture, our way of doing things, because of those ties. So why is it only now that we're talking about airlift between the African continent and the Caribbean? Well, maybe now is the time. Maybe before it just wasn't the time. I don't know. Maybe there are persons who have tried to do this in the past. I don't know for sure. Maybe they've tried and failed. Maybe the conditions just weren't coinciding at the time to make it happen. But for whatever reason it is now, um, we've managed to take a step forward to actually sign an MOU, which opens the door for real flights between the continent of Africa and what we like to call the continent of the Caribbean. We want to be our own big continent, as small as we are. So let's see how that unfolds. Let's see how that changes the way we interact. I'm certainly very excited about it.
Absolutely, me too. Me too. You see, I'm thinking, I have the impression that perhaps between Africans in the diaspora, in this case, we are looking at the Africans in the Caribbean and Africans in Africa, there is somebody that is doing the middleman, who is transferring the information, who is trying to sort of tell you this is what the African says, and this person goes to African and tell you this is what the African diaspora says. Is it possible that we can be giving somebody to do this privilege, giving this privilege to somebody to do the work for us, whereas we can actually be connecting directly to ourselves? If we want to learn anything, we can actually go there to learn it. For example, I've done a lot of interview with university professors in US, and I continue to do. I still have a lot to do because our history is an ocean that we need to explore. So When we say we want to learn about Africa, I don't think it is too complicated because Africa is not a theory. Africa is not something you need to read. It's something you actually can experience. You can see it, no? If you say maybe your ancestors were taken away from Africa, Africa is not in the moon. Africa is in this planet. You can actually go there and find
Yeah.
out for yourself. The, the language they spoke then is the same language they speak today. Irrespective, okay, we can take away the colonial languages. We speak English, Portuguese, and the rest, but there are still the languages that were spoken then, like the Yoruba, the Hausa, the Igbo, the Ashanti. There are many of them. They are still there today. The people are still there. I am thinking that, of course, this is not only to the African diaspora, but even African government at home still need to care about their people in the diaspora. In that, I am thinking that somebody is just doing the joke like this, just playing us like this, and telling, no, this is, yeah, this is what you should take. Now, this is what is real.
Mm.
That is it. Do we have the possibility of able to connect among ourselves, African and African diaspora? That is.
I would say it is being done. Perhaps it's not being done on a huge scale that would get the attention of the media. Because remember, a lot of what we think is, let's admit this, it's influenced by what we see in the news. And depending on the news outlet that you tune into, you're going to get a very different perspective of any country or any people. Uh, the first example that comes to mind is the image of Haiti in mainstream media. Haiti is almost always portrayed as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. It's always portrayed in terms of the violence, and yes, these things are happening in Haiti. There is violence, there's gang violence, there are kidnappings. Yes, there's poverty, but there's a whole other side to Haiti that nobody knows because it's never been portrayed in the media. And unless you go to Haiti, and I really cite Haiti because it was the first Black republic in the hemisphere, okay? And so they are a model for us in the Caribbean, right? They've got 200 years of independence. So had I not had Haitian friends and had I not gone to Haiti myself, and discovered the beautiful side of Haiti, the nature side of Haiti. Had I not had the opportunity to interact with Haitians, I would really just think that Haiti was only what I saw on the television. And so the same goes for the African continent. I mean, how many people I have met who think Africa is one country? Uh, I mean, that's a really extreme case of ignorance. But the reality is that that's kind of the image that's channeled in some places. So unless you seek to inform yourself, unless you try to educate yourself, unless you ask some questions, you may not know that Africa is a whole lot of countries. And as you said, rightfully so, we can go to Africa, we can go see what Africa is, all the different facets of Africa, right? We can experience the language of our ancestors because of the same languages that are being spoken in some cases nowadays. So we have that opportunity. I personally have had that opportunity, and it's been such a privilege. I worked recently in Zimbabwe for 7 months, and although it was at the time when the pandemic broke out, I was able to visit some of the more remote villages. I had never in my life driven for so many hours because I come from a small island. You drive for 3 hours, you reach the end of the island. There's nowhere else to go. You reach in the sea. And there was I in Zimbabwe driving for hours and hours and hours. And I could not see a drop of water anywhere. There was no sea, there was no lake. So for me as a Caribbean person surrounded by water, going to a landlocked country in Africa, it was an amazing journey, an amazing discovery for me to see how people live without water. I mean, I'm probably saying this here, you're thinking, well, what is she talking about? But when you're so used to looking out your window and you can see the sea, and you can drive around the coastline and you can always see the sea, and you get to a place where you drive for hours and you don't see the sea. It's impressive. So that's just one little anecdote. But I was glad that I had that opportunity to visit not just the capital city, which looks very much like a colonial town. You know, the British built quite similar architecture wherever they went. They gave similar names to streets wherever they went. There's always a Queen Street, a King Street, a Prince Street, a King George. You know, in Tobago, for example, we have the capital of Tobago, Scarborough. You have names like Roxborough and Speyside. And you go to Zimbabwe and you have similar names because that's part of the British colonial tradition, the vestiges of colonial days that would have been left behind. But the place, the vegetation, the food, the colors, the scents, so different. And so yes, I agree with you. We have that opportunity to go to discover for ourselves where we came from. And as far as finances allow, we should take that opportunity. I certainly have been able to do so. I will definitely be doing so when that new line comes in through Ghana. I've never been to the West Coast, so I'm definitely going to be making it my business to go to explore the West Coast of Africa.
Thank you so much for that. It is important. It's something that we have to do, but even African government also need to do it because the Africans in diaspora are just your brothers. They are the other part of you. Without them, you are also not complete now, in this sense. So anyway, the argument is actually deeper sometimes, and it is broader. By the way, we are going to have to move a bit. Okay. Now you have a business. Because you will spend some time here, I think it's right that you spend this few seconds to let people know how they can profit from your business. What do you do, and how can people benefit from it? Please go.
So I started a business in what I love. For many, many years, I worked in the field of communications, but I've decided to dedicate myself entirely to my first love, which is languages. And so I have a language services agency called Interpreting Your Needs. And we do exactly what we say. We interpret your language needs and we provide the solution. So we provide conference interpreting services, translation of documents, but also multilingual project management. And how can people benefit from my services? Well, you know, I have to say, thanks to COVID, and yes, COVID has caused great loss around the globe. But I have to acknowledge that thanks to COVID, the technologies have evolved so quickly. The technologies for online virtual meetings, for example, which would have been in development prior to COVID, were accelerated thanks to COVID. And so now I can work from right here on my little island with my dog barking and next to the sea. I can work from here. And I have been serving as an interpreter for meetings globally with participants tuning in from Africa. Actually, just last week I had a conference like that. The participants we're part of the power pool, the North African power pool. We were talking about renewable energy with an interpreter, another interpreter I was working. She was in Spain. I'm here in the Caribbean, and the participants are on the African continent. So it's a global village. It's a global service right here from the comfort of home, and I'm able to work with people across time zones. It doesn't matter anymore. Hey, if I have to get up at 3 in the morning to serve you, I will do so. That's okay. But essentially, I am doing what I love, and I love serving people. I love helping people to bridge language barriers. I love that I get to be that bridge so that they can communicate their ideas, that they can collaborate with people across the globe to solve problems that they are facing, and that through that bridge, there can be progress. That's how I see myself. That's how I see my service. And so I'm very happy to do so. You can reach out to me or visit our website, interpretingyourneeds.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can look out for me, Gennike. I get a lot of questions on LinkedIn that I'm happy to answer, and just to make friendly connections. Yes, there's a lot of business on LinkedIn, but very friendly connections. People just wanting to get to know who you are, how things are like in your country. So I'm open to that as well.
What would be the final statement here, looking at what we have discussed today? Maybe a message of yours or anything you think can be the conclusion of the conversation. Please go.
My final thoughts, Obehi, I want to come right back to Nelson Mandela, pay tribute to him and for his journey that has impacted the globe. And he visited my country many years ago. But just to remind us, he said, you speak to a man in a language he understands, it goes to his head. But if you speak to a man in his language, it goes to his heart. And that is what I want to leave you and your audience with, that it's a different connection. It's a heart connection when you speak the language of the person that you're speaking with. Yes, they may be able to speak your language, but it's a different conversation when you can speak that person's language. That's the value of learning a foreign language. It really is a superpower.
Gennike Mayers, thank you so much. It really will be a very interesting and a full lecture. Thank you so much.
Grazie, Obehi. Ciao.
Grazie. Thank you. If you enjoy this podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi Podcast and share with your friends who might need it. I remain Obehi Ewafo. Thank you so much for listening and talk to you in the next episode.